Okay, ladies, I'm just going to take you through the next poem from Module A, Language, Identity and Culture, which is Translucent Jade by Maureen Ten. Now you'll notice here that we've also got written on the screen her Chinese name, and her Chinese name ends in U, which is the Chinese word for jade. So when we think about the title of this poem, it's really metaphoric because it refers to herself. And when we think about all of the poems that we've looked at so far, they are really about the nature of identity and coming to terms with your identity and discovering who you are. So it's really interesting that she refers to herself, which the word jade has double meaning in terms of her own heritage and Chinese culture, but also her name. So thinking about the idea of translucent jade in terms of the colouring of the jade and the idea of it being transparent or see-through. So perhaps she's trying to develop a sense of identity and see through to discover who she is. And as we go through the poem, we might be able to discuss that in a little bit more detail. So Maureen is a Malaysian Chinese poet who migrated to Australia in 1989, and the title of the poem, as we mentioned, Translucent Jade, has a number of meanings, and we'll go through those in more detail shortly. The Chinese term for jade is Yu, which is often used as a family name, and Yu is the name that Tan was inherited from her grandfather, which is quite interesting because the jade in which is featured within the narrative of the poem is given to her by her grandfather. And when struck, the translucent jade also produces a sound which is a symbol of music, and hence the reference to the sound towards the end of the poem. You can actually go onto YouTube and hear the sound of jade being struck, and it's really a beautiful chime-like sound. The poem explores the impact of migration on cultural identity, and in particular her identity. When migrating, it is common for parents to give their children English names to assist them in settling into their culture of an English-speaking country. So I guess for Ten, she really struggled in terms of her identity, in that perhaps she didn't feel particularly Australian because of her Chinese background, yet she didn't feel like she perhaps identified with her Chinese ancestry because of her name. So the idea of it becoming more translucent to her, this idea of her name and the translucent jade, is perhaps her gaining a sense of understanding of herself, her culture and her identity, which is really interesting because it's through the language of this poem. So that really blends together all aspects of our module really nicely. When looking at the key messages or key ideas, the key concepts within this poem, obviously the key ideas are identity, cultural inheritance, personal change, and adapting to be accepted into a culture. Now, when we think about that cultural inheritance, I think that really connects really nicely to This Is Where It Begins. So I think that these two poems, This Is Where It Begins and Translucent Jade, could be really studied nicely together in terms of them complementing each other, that through storytelling or through ancestry, we're able to help gain a sense of identity. So jade is a spiritual stone with significant meaning that's woven into Chinese culture. So the Chinese have often revered jade for its green colour and its discovery in Burma. So the top quality jade is quite rare and it has a very vivid, sleek and translucent appearance to it, and it can be quite expensive. So jade is quite a special stone and it's believed to promote wisdom, balance, and peace. The myth of ancient China indicated that jade gemstones can be referred to as a crystallized moonlight which has fallen down to the earth from the highest tip of the most holy mountains. It doesn't need any purification of any type in order to get rid of any negative vibrations, since it is a genuine gift from heaven. People who may have wondered about the cleansing process of the gemstone shouldn't speculate anymore, as it's naturally serene and clear. So the jade stone emits a mild and relaxing vibration, and she refers to that vibration within her poem. Okay, so now that we've gone through some of the overview of the poem, we're going to now go through each of the stanzas one by one, and I'll take some time to read over each of these stanzas and then discuss some of the techniques and some of the concepts that are explored within the poem. So just in reading the first stanza, so it says, "My grandfather made me a gift when I was born. I used it for a while until another gift, my mother's, flashed in view. Common in its place at origin, here her gift sparkled and sang, replaced the other. Not that his was jolted aside, but it sort of slipped away. No one seemed to mind, if they noticed, as it lay in disuse, and then was quite forgotten." So in looking at this first stanza, we can see that it is really a highly personal and narrative poem that's been presented here by Ten. And we can see that in the first stanza, she's really sort of discussing that fleeting attention that the gift from her grandfather has given her, as she then is sparked by the attention of something that her mother has given her instead. It then goes on later in that stanza to say that no one seemed to mind if they noticed. So it was almost as though her family, or the rest of her family, hadn't really noticed that the gift that her grandfather had given her had slipped away from use, and that it lay in disuse and was really quite forgotten. Now, if we take a metaphorical stance on this first stanza, and we see the mother's gift perhaps as a metaphorical representation of her life in Australia as a young migrant girl, and perhaps then her grandfather's gift of the jade, which perhaps could be a necklace or something like that, as a gift from her cultural heritage. So really, I guess the sparkled and sang, the alliteration there and the imagery of it being quite beautiful and new and exciting, and something that sang to her, something that spoke to her in terms of her life in Australia, being shiny and new, and perhaps some of the more active verbs that are presented here in terms of jolted aside, that her grandfather's gift was jolted aside. So that having connotations of it almost being disrespectfully pushed aside, and in it being slipped away. So again, the connotations there of being slipped away, that it was an accidental or unintentional act, that this piece of jade was forgotten about. And I think that it was quite forgotten is quite interesting there, in that as she, I guess, tried to formalise her sense of identity as a young migrant girl in Australia, her cultural heritage was lost, and that perhaps that was quite forgotten as she, I guess, tried to find her sense of self and her sense of identity. Looking at the second stanza, it reads, "Today I retrieved his gift from its silence, barely, rarely used. It seemed mostly new, pristine. I tried it on. It was a little strange, as if from a world I hadn't inhabited, but had heard stories about. Sometimes I felt like an imposter. Sometimes I thought it reflected hidden aspects I could own." Now, I really like this stanza because I think that this is where she's sort of really starting to express the transition and the concern about her sense of identity and where her sense of self comes from. Um, in terms of today, she retrieved her gift from the silence. So in the previous stanza, we had that her mother's gift sparkled and sang. And now in the second stanza, we've got the juxtaposition there that she's retrieved her grandfather's gift from this silence. And I think that that's really interesting that she's um, had to go back into this silence to retrieve this gift of her cultural heritage. It goes on to say, barely, rarely used, it seemed mostly new. And I really like that pairing there of the barely and rarely. I think that the couple of words that are used, barely and rarely, to really make that sense of connection and rhyming there highlights that it really was something that she had pushed aside, and it seemed mostly new. Although her cultural heritage, which is so much a part of her and her family history, seemed really new to her and something that she knew very little about. Almost pristine, in fact, and she tried it on. I really like the shortness of these the truncated sentences that have been used in this stanza here to really highlight the slowness in which she's coming back to terms with this cultural heritage and this jade gift from her grandfather and trying it on, and that it feels a little strange. Um, that idea that she is, I guess, coming to terms with her sense of self, and really having this nostalgic appreciation for the gift that was once given to her by her grandfather, which is as if it's from another world that she hadn't inhabited. So there's a real sense of mystery here, and a bit of a sensory imagery in terms of whether she can feel that she belongs to this world, um, that she had heard stories about perhaps, but yet had not um, been involved in. And again, we've got that really nice connection here of that idea of identity through storytelling, which we did see in one of the other poems by Marinda Bobbis. So again, this is that really nice connection that you could develop between two poems and see them as a nice pairing. Moving on to the last two lines of this stanza, we've got a sense of anaphora in terms of the mixing of emotions. Sometimes I feel like an imposter, and sometimes I thought it reflected hidden aspects I could own. And the idea there of that hidden aspects and the diction of imposter, that she feels that she doesn't yet have that connection, but there is an aspect of hope there in that she aspects I could own. So although we've got that real low modality there of could, there is that sense of hope in the mixed emotions that she's feeling in terms of her sense of identity and in terms of her cultural um, heritage, her Chinese cultural heritage, and her migrant Australian culture as well. And finally, we have our final stanza, which reads, what vibrations are these? Does this begin to become me? Do I belong? This translucent, slowly yielding music, Chinese name. Now, I really feel that there's a sense of excitement and a sense of hope, and a sense of connection back to her Chinese culture here in this final stanza. We've got a couple of rhetorical questions. So looking at the first one there, what vibrations are these? So the rhetorical question there really captures her sense of excitement in what she's discovering about herself and her Chinese cultural heritage. And then she goes on to question further, does this begin to become me? Do I belong? So she's got that idea of do I belong to this Chinese heritage? Is this a part of me, or am I Australian Chinese? She's having that really toing and froing of that sense of identity there. and this translucent, slowly yielding music, Chinese name. So we've got there the idea that she is questioning, does it belong to her? Or does, in terms of does the gift, her cultural heritage belong to her? Or is it the cultural heritage that owns her? So there's that real sense of, is it me that belongs to this, or do I belong? So how is it that we can view that? And the rhetorical questions, I think, really serve to show a gradual connection and acceptance to her Chinese culture through her Chinese name. And we did talk previously about the idea that this Chinese name is symbolic, in that it is symbolic of the gift that is given to her by her grandfather, in that of jade, and her Chinese name. Um, and I think the idea there of that translucent, slowly yielding music. So it's almost as if she's eagerly awaiting for it to all be revealed to her, in terms of as she discovers the value of her cultural heritage, as she begins to, as she's had this gift unfold in front of her, and she's discovering more about it and wanting to know more about it, in terms of what are these vibrations, what is it that this cultural heritage can give to me. And so finally, looking at the poem as it ties together the intimate connection between language and the idea here of not only the techniques and the language that Chen has used to pull out her idea and her storytelling as she delivers this poem, but also the cultural identity of her name and her sense of identity which she gets from her name. And the significance here of an inherited name in comparison to the names migrants put on for cultural acceptance is considered and challenged throughout the poem. So as she has a sense of, I guess, disconnection and then reconnection, as she tries to establish a sense of identity in who she is and where she belongs in terms of her cultural identity and her family heritage. And I just wanted to go back to one of the points that I think um, that I mentioned when we were looking at stanza one, in terms of that idea of the metaphorical gift that her mother has given to her, perhaps as her migrant life in Australia, yet her grandfather's gift of her cultural identity, which is the Chinese heritage. And throughout the poem, she's really coming to terms with her sense of self. And I guess it can be seen as that symbolic gateway. This jade, this translucent jade, can be seen as that symbolic gateway of her Chinese heritage, as she comes to terms with who she is, and I guess where in fact she fits within that sense of culture and that sense of identity.